I am honored to welcome Dr. Kasturi to our podcast today. Ma'am has been an interdisciplinary researcher and an academician for over 25 years now. Her area of expertise are in trade, economics, sustainable development, among others. Ma'am is just back from her stint at the Yale University, where she was a visiting Fulbright Climate Fellow at the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. So let's dive right into the conversation we have with ma'am today. So ma'am, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Aditya and team, for having me here in today's conversation on a topic which is very close to my heart, and this was also the focus of my research while I was at Yale.
Yes, ma'am. So let's start the discussion. Tell the audience about what is this carbon border adjustment mechanism and why is it so important in today's context?
Absolutely. Let me take a step back, Aditya, for a wider audience. Let's start from the Paris Agreement of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was reached in 2015. Now, if you look at the Paris Agreement, it had set the goal of keeping the global temperature increase well below 2 degrees Celsius, or more ambitiously within 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial level. Now, given that target, obviously different countries are doing different things, including direct carbon pricing instruments like carbon tax, cap and trade system, etc. But there are other kinds of instruments as well, like different regulatory instruments which are in place. However, if you look at the latest emissions gap report of the United Nations that came up in 2024, it is clear that despite all the efforts the countries are undertaking, there is still huge gap in terms of how much emission reduction needs to happen if we have to reach the Paris Agreement's goal, and how much is currently happening. So why I started from there, the short point I'm trying to make here is that there is an enormous requirement to increase the ambition of different countries in terms of their mitigation efforts and the initiatives they are undertaking. Now, it is in this context we have to see that what different countries are doing in terms of carbon pricing. If you look at again the World Bank report, the latest one on state and trends of carbon pricing, you will find that in today's world, despite all the efforts, only around 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered with direct carbon pricing. Now, when I say direct carbon pricing, it could be a carbon tax or it could be a cap and trade system. Okay. Now, only 24% of global emissions are covered under that. So, you can imagine that the rest are not covered under direct carbon pricing, but there may be other kinds of measures. On top of that, if you look at the range of carbon pricing that is prevailing in different parts of the globe, you will find that that's a huge range. Now, on top of that, if you look at the range of carbon pricing in different parts of the globe, it's a huge range, starting from say less than $1 around $0.46 to as high as $167 per unit of carbon emissions.
So there is no uniformity there?
Not at all.
Okay.
So the whole point I'm trying to make here is, although there are different carbon pricing instruments that are in place, there is a huge gap in terms of how much is covered under direct carbon pricing, and the second point is that there is a range of carbon pricing. So we are still living in a world of unequal carbon prices. Now, what problem arises when you have unequal carbon prices from different countries? Think of it that there are two countries, okay, right?
Yeah.
Country A and country B. Suppose there is a carbon price in country A, which is affecting a highly emitting sector like steel. Okay. And there is country B, which also produces steel, but there is no such carbon price in country B. Now, country A not only produces steel but also imports steel from country B. Right. Now, think of the businesses in the steel sector in country A. What problem they will face? They will face one problem, that they can say that they are not getting the level playing field vis-a-vis the imported steel that are coming from country B, because it's not a level playing field because of the reason that in country B there is no carbon price, whereas in country A the steel sector is facing the carbon price. So it's unequal, not level.
Yes, ma'am.
So what may be their reaction of the businesses? Obviously they will be happy, that is the first point. But strategically they can even think of relocating to country A or for that matter anywhere in the world where there is no or less stringent carbon price.
And even for countries that are taking this initiative of imposing carbon tax or other things, they don't have the incentive of doing it, because if businesses are shifting outside, it will be a cost for them.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. So why they won't have the incentive to do it is that they would find that some of their businesses are planning to relocate because country A is trying to do more in the area of carbon pricing. Their businesses are getting adversely impacted and they can even think of relocating. So why there would be any incentive for country A to do more in terms of carbon emission reduction? Because they will feel that whatever emission reduction they are planning to do in their own jurisdiction, a part of it would get negated because of relocation of these businesses to other parts of the world where there is less stringent carbon pricing.
And even their supply chain, if they are importing for other industries, will not be as sustainable as they want it to be.
Absolutely. So this is the problem of carbon leakage. And when we talk about carbon border adjustment mechanism or CBAM that the European Union has come up with recently, then it is one of the measures that they have thought of to tackle this problem of carbon leakage. So if you have to understand carbon border adjustment mechanism, then you have to understand the problem of carbon leakage. So that's why I explained the carbon leakage to you.
Ma'am, so can you elaborate more on how this CBAM is actually going to work in the European Union?
Right. So European Union is at the forefront of carbon pricing. They started with their cap and trade system, which is called the European Union Emission Trading Scheme, way back in 2005.
Okay.
But they still had some flexibilities in terms of how the emission allowances were getting distributed. They were distributing it free of cost, which was beneficial for those emission intensive and trade exposed sectors like steel, aluminium, glass, etc., which was helping them in terms of maintaining their competitiveness to some extent in face of this risk of carbon leakage. However, more recently, with the advent of the European Green Deal, the European Union is now trying to make the carbon pricing more stringent by introducing auctioning, while they are going to distribute the emission allowances. Now, when they are trying to make the pricing more stringent, obviously the risk of carbon leakage is expected to be more. It is in this context they introduced the CBAM, and what they are trying to do is to impose a requirement on imports of these sectors which are covered under CBAM like steel, aluminium, etc. The whole purpose of it is impose a requirement on imported items in these sectors so that a level playing field is created between imports and domestically produced items, saying steel.
Okay, so basically it's not giving an unfair advantage to any import.
That is what they argue.
Yeah. So ma'am, now that I have understood what CBAM is, I went through your paper and I think it is mostly about the impact this CBAM is going to have on Indian businesses and especially the steel sector. So can you please share the findings that you have after this research?
Absolutely. So Aditya, if you look at the European Union CBAM, mind you that European Union is not the one country or jurisdiction that has come up with CBAM, and it was not discussed earlier, not like that. It has been discussed in the academic and policy circles since long. However, European Union is the first jurisdiction to come up with such a measure. The more generic term that is used for such kind of measure is border carbon adjustment, and CBAM is a term coined by the European Union. Now, if you look at the European Union CBAM, they not only have this objective of tackling carbon leakage, but also they would like to induce their trading partners to do more in terms of decarbonization. Okay, so it is in this context that me and my co-author from IIM Lucknow, Professor Kaushik Ranjan Bandyopadhyay, we undertook this research where we tried to understand that how maybe the steel sector in India get impacted by the CBAM because it is just starting. It came into existence in October 2023 and we are just in the early stage of CBAM. So how might the sector get impacted?
Ma'am, so what were the major findings you had after this research, the impacts that the steel sector will have in India?
So let me share that it was a qualitative research study that we undertook, and we wanted to understand the ground realities, that what the stakeholders are actually saying. And when I say stakeholders, a major stakeholder obviously are the steel farms, and there are two kinds of players here: the big players or integrated steel plants. On the other hand, you have the small players or the MSMEs, that is the micro, small and medium scale industries. So we looked at both and we reached out to both. What we found is a very striking difference in terms of the expected impact of CBAM on the steel sector between, on the one hand, the big players and on the other hand, the small players. We found that the big players, talk about Tata Steel, JSW Steel, SAIL, these are big players. I am not saying that who said what, because we have to maintain this anonymity for our research.
Yes,
but what I am trying to say is that in general, the big players are undertaking measures for decarbonization in big way, in various ways. For the paucity of time, I am not getting into the details. However, CBAM has a very specific timeline, and we found that it is not easy for the big players also to convert their entire steel production into that kind of low carbon steel in a very short span of time that CBAM is forcing. However, they would not like to lose out on the European market because it's a very important market. So what they're strategizing in a way is that they are trying to produce low carbon steel for sending to European market on the one hand, and maybe relatively higher carbon steel for other markets, including domestic market in India. Because in India you have a huge domestic market for steel as well. So that is one way they are planning to strategize, at least in the immediate short run, to deal with the problem of decarbonization in face of CBAM. When it comes to small players, they are in a very sad state of affairs, I would say, in terms of decarbonization, because although they are willing, but they have various capacity constraints which are preventing them to do a lot in the decarbonization space, and that is why the CBAM, when it comes into effect fully, that is in starting of January 2026, when the actual carbon price gets impacted, with the actual carbon price gets imposed on the imports at the European Union, then the small players are likely to get more impacted adversely in both ways. It could be directly if they are involved in export of steel to European Union, or indirectly if they are part of the steel supply chain and get impacted indirectly.
And also I think the competition in India would increase because not much quantity of the steel can now be exported because of all the restrictions. So in the local markets also they'll be facing higher competition.
That is something it may or may not happen. It all depends on what strategies the steel firms adopt and how they strategize, because on the one hand you have European Union with CBAM, but European Union is not alone. There are other countries and jurisdictions who are already planning some such measures. For instance, there are some bills proposed in the United States. There are initiatives already undertaken in United Kingdom. There are also other jurisdictions which are contemplating CBAM kind of measure. Now, if these happen, then obviously exports in those sectors might also get impacted. There comes the question that to what extent the steel exports that might get impacted by such carbon pricing elsewhere in the export market, where they can get diverted. Mind you that India has a huge domestic market, so that obviously is an option, but there may be other export jurisdictions which are not having that kind of stringent carbon pricing. Those options might also be there. So it depends on how the company strategize to deal with this problem. and how far that would impact the situation of competition within the domestic market.
Well, ma'am, we have talked about different countries contemplating on such laws. It's a good time to introduce the Brussels effect. Can you tell the audience about what the Brussels effect is?
Yeah, so if you look at our paper, you would have noted that the conceptual framework of the paper is built on what is called the Brussels effect. This is a conceptualization that was introduced by Columbia University Professor Anu Bradford, and as per her understanding, she came up with this idea that think of European Union. European Union often is ahead of the curve in various ways of regulating different things, and it is not only in the area of environment, it could be in the area of digital commerce and various other things. Now, the Brussels effect is talking about this, that suppose there is a regulation that comes up in European Union which is more stringent than elsewhere in the world, how far that might induce other countries of the world to actually mirror that kind of regulation that EU has come up with. Now, this can happen through the market forces, and Brussels effect talks about that. What do I mean by market forces? Suppose in case of CBAM, what we try to understand is, because as I said, the Indian companies would still be willing to continue to export to Europe despite CBAM. Now, if they have to do that, then they have to maintain the competitiveness also. So they may be induced to do more in terms of decarbonization of that part at least of their production, which they are planning to send to Europe. Now, if that happens, and as you mentioned that whether they will face competition domestically, think of a scenario that these companies are undertaking measures to decarbonize, and that would be costly for them.
Yes.
And if they face competition from other players within the domestic market who are not undertaking such initiatives to decarbonize faster because they are not exporting to, say, European Union, what would happen? Obviously, in the domestic market, these companies would face more competition. Again, there would be a lack of level playing field for them. So if that happens, they might induce or lobby with their government, like the government of India, to make the carbon pricing more stringent and mirror the carbon pricing system in European Union. If that happens, then we say that it is a Brussels effect that is taking place.
So, ma'am, because you have ended at that note, can we expect similar laws in India in the near future, or will it take some time for India to adapt to these new laws?
So let me tell you, let us distinguish between Brussels effect and Indian initiative in this way. That Brussels effect is about whether CBAM in European Union is inducing Indian government to do more in terms of regulating carbon pricing. However, in our findings, we found that we could not find any conclusive evidence of Brussels effect on the regulatory space. See, Aditya, in terms of our research, we could not find any conclusive evidence that actually at the regulatory space, Brussels effect is working in India in terms of CBAM. However, that does not mean that the government of India is not taking initiative for decarbonization of steel sector, or for that matter other sectors. Because if you look at the government initiatives, then you would know that government has already set the target of reaching net zero by 2070. Now, in tandem with that, the steel sector and the Ministry of Steel has also set in place short-term, medium-term and long-term targets for decarbonization. And they have already put in place a lot of measures. However, that does not mean that these are getting impacted by the Brussels effect. For instance, recently the government has also come up with a cap and trade system, the CCTS in India.
Yes.
But we went back to the stakeholders, tried to understand that whether CCTS came up in India as a result of CBAM in EU. But we could not find any conclusive evidence of that kind of Brussels effect happening in the regulatory space.
Fair enough, ma'am. I think we should end this podcast with policy recommendations, because I went through your paper and you have extensively mentioned few policy recommendations. Can you please talk about that?
Yeah, you can look at the policy recommendations from the European Union's angle or from the angle of any other country that may contemplate CBAM kind of measure. Because this climate change, how the problem of climate change got triggered, there is a north-south divide here, and there comes the question of historical emissions, there comes the question of climate justice, and so on. So it is in this context we argue in our paper that if European Union, or for that matter other jurisdictions that are planning to come up with CBAM kind of measure, if they are really willing to see that these sectors in their trading partners are decarbonizing faster, then what they can do is that to support that kind of effort, particularly by the MSMEs, by providing financial support, technological support, and other kinds of capacity building support, so that they are in a better position and better placed to do more for decarbonization. If that happens, then that would not only help European Union or other jurisdictions who are trying to use CBAM to achieve the climate goal as they claim, they would also be able to achieve their goal. At the same time, decarbonization in the developing and least developed countries would be far more easier, and all this would help the global emission scenario, and we will be in a better position to reach the Paris Agreement's goal. So that is what we would like to recommend.
Yes. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time. I think our audience will have gained a lot of knowledge about the future of policies in terms of sustainability and environment. Thank you so much for your time.
Aditya and team for this opportunity. It was lovely talking to you, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.